Hello, I'm Jasmine Tsou, owner of JTT in New York, and today I'm speaking with my mentor, John Ollman of Fleischer Ollman Gallery in Philadelphia, one of the galleries participating in the Outsider Art Fair's digital exhibition Art Brut Global, which is online now through May 29th. You can check out the exhibition through the link in the bio or at theoutsiderartfair.com. John and I will be discussing one of the artists that he is showing, Felipe Consalvos. Hi, John.
Hi, Jasmine.
How are you, John?
Aren't you surprised that I even know how to do this?
I am very impressed. You've got one over Joe Biden right now. I'm very
Yeah,
impressed.
I learned that I just learned this in the last couple of months. So
Well, that's great. And you are talking to us from Maine right now, is that
I
right?
am in Maine for the summer, for the till fall. The gallery's moving, and they're moving this week, so they didn't want me there to help.
Okay, well, we can chat all day. We should focus on Consalvos, okay?
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you about Consalvos. How did you start, or when did you start showing Consalvos's work?
We started showing Consalvos's work in 2002, but I had known about it for about almost 20 years before that. So.
Wow, what made you start showing it in 2002?
Well, the history of the work is that it was discovered by Jack Lindsay, who was then a curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he was a, you know, dogged yard sale person and flea market person, and he went to every known yard sale, I think, on the East Coast. And in 1982, he saw there was a yard sale in West Philadelphia, and he saw 5 pieces of work that turned out to be by Consalvos. And he arranged to buy them, or he told the woman they really liked them. And she said, oh, well, we have some more, come back in the garage. And in the garage were the other 850 pieces that made up the body of Consalvos's work. And the woman selling them was Felipe Consalvos's niece and his sole surviving relative. So Jack and his brother and another family member put together a group, and they went back and they bought everything. And because Jack was working at the museum, he felt it was inappropriate to try and sell them, although I, maybe a couple of years after that, saw a couple of them in his house. But we knew, because we were friends, that at the point that he stopped working in the museum world, he would start putting them up for sale. And so he retired from the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2001, thereabouts, and shortly thereafter, we had our first exhibition of the work.
That's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Did the PMA ever acquire work of Consalvos's?
The PMA has work of Consalvos, yes. Mm-hmm. Several. I can't remember exactly how many. Several people have bought them and given them to the museum, including Jack. Mm-hmm. So.
Cool. And how many shows have you done with Consalvos now?
Oh my God, I don't know. You did one. You curated one, which was amazing. I would say probably 4. I mean, full one-person shows, and then we did a single presentation of him at Frieze New York about 3 or 4 years ago.
So to kind of paraphrase a little bit of what Consalvos does is he collages tobacco ephemera, essentially, alongside a lot of different items. And he is unique in the way that he collages, even though it emerges from a culture of collaging. So could you speak to what about his work is unique in the way that he collages?
Well, I think the interest, of course, we don't know the dates of the work. I mean, there's only, in the 850 or so works, we've only seen 3 or 4 that actually had dates on them. Mm-hmm. But looking at the work and thinking about sort of collage as an activity or as a creative, endeavor, there was a sort of folk tradition of doing cigar band collaging in the early part of the 20th century. And we think, and I look at the what I think is the earlier work tends to be, that type of decorative work. Some point later, I'm thinking probably in the 30s or 40s, it started evolving into a content-based collage creations. And those became, then he started focusing on political statements, which, kind of are hard to, grasp exactly what what positions he's taking. He can be very oblique at times. There's a lot of sort of sexual double entendre. There's lots of language in the collage work, which gives a clue to what he was thinking about. But because they were done completely in secret, we don't really know exactly what his political positions were, what his sexual orientation was. There's lots of, suggestions in the work that people can read into. Of course, one of his primary collage elements was money, and he cut up, as you know, he cut up hundreds and hundreds of US dollar bills to get the head of George Washington, which was one of his favorite characters in his collages. I would say 80% of all the collages have George Washington represented in them.
So Brandon Greaves, who was once a director at the gallery, wrote an interesting theory onto where the George Washingtons come from. So to step back, cigar band collaging became popular around the time where we decided that it was no longer hygienic to use spit when rolling cigars. So they started to use glue, very small amounts of glue in the early 1900s. And then people that were collaging started to use that glue to collage. And they were banding, they were making collages with that. And Brendan Greaves said that this became so popular among housewives that they would send out at one point like a collage kit, and in that collage kit had a George Washington head in it. It's in the early 1900s. John, it's in this really great book that you published. If you want to read it sometime. But I, of course, have a theory that is contrary to Brandon's, which is that George Washington was a famous Mason.
Right.
And the Cubans, there's a long history of the Masons in Cuba. And it's an interesting place because it's the only area where Marxism and the Freemasons coincide. In all other parts of the world, they do not mix well because the Freemasons are kind of opposing in ideals with Marxism. So I find that's like a really interesting mix in his work that I see a lot. And you bring up sexual orientation, which I find just funny because I think what you're referring to is the fact that George Washington is dressed in drag a lot in the work. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, there's that, but there's a lot of male imagery in the collages that comes from the sort of Bob Miser kind of muscle magazines from the early 50s, which is, there's an implication in the uses of that and that he was accessing that material.
Right. So Bob Miser being the photographer that would photograph men in sort of athletic poses.
Right.
But
and sexually suggestive ones as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. I never thought of that connection.
I mean, it's very unusual when you look at collage work from that, it's from the late 40s and early 50s to see that much sort of beefcake in the use of the collage. It's not very common.
I guess I'm surprised because I feel like the imagery that you're talking about, there's a lot of like medical examinations, but you're kind of looking in some of that as like actual posing that feels suggestive.
Yeah, I mean, and because we didn't really know what he was thinking, it's hard to come up with a concrete position on that.
Right, because I look at the way that the men are postured, and I think of Masonic rituals. So
okay,
the mystery that is Consalvos in that way,
and will remain so.
So you have how many pieces are on this online platform now? You have six?
Six, I guess, including one of my all-time favorite pieces, which is the one which Andrew has for sale. And it's the one in the elaborate carved frame, which is, we assumed that he found those frames. There were only a handful in the collection of these sort of Victorian frames, and that one's like a screaming head, and there's lots of text that is very political. But the more interesting part of that piece to me, and one of the reasons I like it so much, is the backside. A lot of the work, as you know, it's double-sided, and the backside is this huge photograph of some kind of massacre in China, I think probably the 30s or 40s. I mean, it's a horrific photograph, and that's the backside of that piece.
Wow.
And it relates to the front in a way that many of the other backs don't relate to the fronts of the other collages. And I think it's an incredibly powerful piece.
Brendan's written about also kind of some of the culture that this emerges from, specifically the fact that among men that would come together that were rolling cigars, there would be at least one or two or three or four that would be those that could read and that would read a lot of books aloud to the larger groups.
A lot of poetry, right?
And he had Consalvos had a huge poetry collection.
He had poetry collections. There were books that we think were actual poems by him. He was, he was literate, very literate, and spoke at least 3 languages.
Wow.
So he was totally fluent, obviously, in Spanish, but also in English. And you can tell that from the text in the collage where he plays, where he makes these really interesting jokes and plays with words in English, which is a difficult thing to do when that is your second language. In the poetry books, there were also French poems written in French. So we assumed that he also spoke French. So, and they not only did they read poetry, but they read political writings. There was also a lot of music played. So there's a big obsession with music throughout the collages, including the fact that he collaged many, many types of musical instruments.
Is that the way that he would reference music, through musical instruments? Would he reference specific songs?
I don't think there's any reference to particular songs, but we know that that he was obsessed with music.
Also, something interesting about Consalvos is that, of course, he uses the Campbell's soup can very early on.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a nod more than anything to just that he's engaging in this idea of what pop art later becomes very early. How would you say that Consalvos's use of pop art was unique to him?
Wow. Well, obviously, it was years and years before popular imagery became sort of a thing. And I think it was the images that were accessible to him. And, he's obviously pulling imagery from popular culture magazines, obviously Life, Look, those kinds of primary picture magazines.
Do you feel like because he was, born in Havana and was in the States, was a bit of a different, unique position? I feel like a lot of the artists that later explored pop art are, born in America, living in New York, and right. He has a little bit of a different perspective on consumerism or even America's relationship to Cuba.
I mean, I go back to my own childhood, and I think the images that were so predominant are the images that you see in his collages. I mean, Campbell's soup was a staple in our house, right? He uses certain brands of toothpaste in imagery, which were the toothpastes that were common in our time period. I think he's just using objects that are sort of a type of language of that time period. And I think that the pop artists and like Warhol goes back and sees that as a form of language of how you identify with, certain cultural touchstones.
Right. Um, and then also, it's interesting that he uses imagery of Campbell soup cans as opposed to actually using the labeling of it at all. So
Yeah, right.
it's actually like he's appropriating from commercials or from magazines and newspapers in that particular instance, whereas with other things, he's using actual photographs or actual.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he uses actual dollar bills for George Washington, but uses photographs of Campbell soup cans as opposed to the label. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, it's very interesting. I think part of it, I think, is the photographs of the cans are more three-dimensional, and they give you get a different sense of the image when you use a photograph than you do as when you use a label.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, the labels, I mean, the cigar bands are obviously the actual cigar bands, and the types of things that line cigar boxes, he uses all of that type of material, straight on.
Right.
There are other things where he uses the actual, thing, those lotto game cards and, all that other sort of that type of material that was immediate to him.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. I think it's probably just the image of the can in a photo is more interesting than the actual label.
And you do like you believe that his family helped him make some of his work as well. His son helped.
Well, so Jack Lindsay interviewed his niece when he bought all the material, and she wrote literally one page in Spanish of what she knew about her uncle, and basically it was that the family was not so thrilled with him as for the fact that he was doing all of this, mostly because it was during a time when a dollar bill meant was no insignificant sum, and he's cutting them up. Despite the fact that it's illegal, but it was more that there was money. So we have very scant information about that or about his family. We know he was married, or we were told by the niece that he was married. He had a son, both of whom predeceased him. She seemed to think that the son at some point helped him with these collages, but it's impossible to tell that or to prove that. And then Jack, realizing that he didn't really have that much information from her, went back months later to interview her again, and she had passed away. So it was that one single page that survived of the family's, this is who he was. And it was it was more of like there was an onus on them that they even had to save, that they even saved and stored this stuff. I mean, part of it was, we think, was that, besides all of the other imagery that's in there, there's a lot of family photographs that have been incorporated into some of the work, and that was probably the only thing that got the work saved.
Mm.
So, and it wasn't that long after. I mean, we think he died in 68 or 69, and she sold all the stuff in 82. So it was just a little less than 15 years or so.
Can you identify the ones that have family photographs, or you just know that there's
Well,
some?
we see some that that they look like there are ones with tintypes and that kind of material, as opposed to the studio photographs that make up so much of the work.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what? So originally he went from Havana to Florida and to
Yeah,
Miami. You know what brought him up
maybe
to?
Tampa.
Yep. Yeah, great. Because in Tampa there was a huge
Right.
cigar rolling culture. And then do you know what brought him to Philadelphia?
Well, he went to New York next.
Oh,
So he
New York.
went from Tampa to New York, where there was a huge cigar rolling industry as well, mostly done by Cubans.
Right.
That occurred during the Depression, sometime in the 30s. Worked in Lower Manhattan and lived in Brooklyn. The wife and the son pass away sometime in the late 50s or early 60s, and he is not well and moves everything to live with his niece in Philadelphia. And then he died in Philadelphia.
Okay.
So that's the information from the niece.
Right. Right. And do you see any of the geographical areas that he lives in the work at all? Is he referencing the?
There's quite a number. Well, not quite a number. There's a handful of collages over the map of Cuba. So obviously he lived in Cuba. There's a lot of references to New York. I mean, particularly if you look at those envelopes with the George Washington and drag inside of them.
Why don't you describe those, because those are some of my favorite pieces. Can you describe them?
Well, they're letter size envelopes that are collaged on the front, occasionally both sides, but generally only on the front. And the envelope opens up, and inside is those 19th century fashion, late 19th century fashion illustrations of women in these big kind of bouffante type dresses. And every single one of them has the collaged head of George Washington, and they fit perfectly inside of the envelope.
So now I believe that they are tombs for George Washington, which lines in with Masonic imagery. But go on, I want to hear your.
Well, I don't know about that, but we always thought that also often the Washington has a sort of a dunce hat on, and so we've always initially we thought that Consalvos was making fun of Washington, but that hat form has some specific Cuban reference to some kind of celebration, which I think Brendan goes into greater detail. Yes, Brendan goes into greater detail in his master's thesis that he wrote about Consalvos.
Yeah. So. Which I would love to reference. I couldn't find it in the middle of COVID. It's in a file somewhere at the gallery, but I have it in my head of some really interesting facts he has in there.
Yeah. Very dense.
Cool. Well, thank you, John.
Let me ask you a question. What inspired you to curate the show at our gallery based on the Masonic references with matching it up with Masonic material?
Well, it was mostly that Charles Harlan at the time was researching a lot of Masonic imagery, and him and I were looking at Consalvos' work together, and he was pointing out to me, oh, that's the all-seeing eye. There's a lot of all-seeing eyes throughout the work, which is a Masonic symbol. There's a lot of clocks, which of course clocks are in general symbolic, but for the Masons, they mean the eternity of time. And so I was very interested in that, particularly just, I felt like it opened up how complex he was as a thinker about capitalism and a thinker about power in general. And I thought that was like just kind of an interesting combination with all of the work that you had already done to share his practice.
I mean, we look at the work and we see obviously that he's cut up these dollar bills for the heads of George Washington. But when you examine the work closer, you realize that he's also pulling out those Masonic images that exist on the dollar bill.
Yeah, well, there's exactly. And there's also a very interesting relationship between the Masons in Cuba that's a little bit, I actually did some research at the library, the Masonic Library in New York, and found that there's some people that believe that the triangle on the Cuban flag is a Masonic triangle. The makers of the flag reference the triangle to these three tenets of the French Revolution, like liberty, and it's like liberty, fraternity, and I forget the third one, but it's interesting that like fraternity is one of those three elements that's important to put into the Cuban Revolution. And I believe that the reason why Cuba took to the Freemasons so well is that it just makes sense to me that the Masons, while there's all this mystery around them, I think ultimately, like a lot of fraternities that emerged in the early 1900s, they were about finance. They were really just about people sharing money in exchange for either protection or community or more money. And I think that it makes sense to me that the Cubans in some way got involved with the Freemasons right after their liberation from Spain. And I don't mean that as like, I just think that I'm in no way an authority on that. I just think that that's what I think about when I look at Consalvos's work. That's what I think he might be pointing to, but.
I know one subject we haven't touched on, and it's the big one, race. So I think race plays a big part in a lot of the collages, and you have to, it's subtly referenced generally, although there were some pieces that are very straight out, dealing with racial issues. One in particular was a book that was, very, very actually disturbing to look at about, I think when he left Cuba and came to the United States, he had to have experienced sort of racial issues in a way that maybe he didn't experience in Cuba. I mean, he wasn't that dark, but still he would have been identified as other and I think that plays a big part in a lot of the work.
Do you know if he was African Cuban or if he was not, if he was?
He looked African Cuban to me, but fairly light skinned.
Which would have been a difficult, there would have been difficulties in Cuba as well in that regard too. Or do you feel like they're more racialized in America?
I think it would have been, particularly being in the South, it might have been really difficult, so.
Yeah, right. All right, well, there's a lot more to talk about there, but I think we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Well, it was fun to talk about Consalvos' work with you, John.
Yeah, it was fun to talk to you as always. How's it going?
It's going good.
Okay.
We'll chat more soon.
Huh?
And we can chat more after this.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.
Okay, bye.